Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. And thank you to everyone for coming here. And I want to ask you, as I start this presentation, have you ever been surprised by how your employees behaved? I'm pleasantly surprised, perhaps, by their resistance to change. Would you like to be able to predict when your employees are going to behave in a pleasantly surprising manner? And would you like to be able to manage, even eliminate these unpleasant surprises? That's the goal. That's what we'll be talking about today. So here's the outline of the presentation. We'll start with discussing why employees behave in this manner, focusing on psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and behavioral economics, the areas of expertise that I bring. Now, then we'll talk about why they behave in this way and what you can do to address their behaviors, to prevent these problematic behaviors from happening. That's going to be the second part of our presentations, 2 parts. The presentation is based on cutting-edge research on social intelligence as well as emotional intelligence. We'll talk about the difference between these, focusing on social intelligence, as well as practices from HR leaders and organizations, including several who are in this room. I conducted a number of interviews with folks in this room to make sure to adapt the presentation to your specific needs in higher ed settings. Now, the presentation will, in some ways, go against things you might be used to, your gut intuitions, some things that you're comfortable with. It's because it's on the cutting edge, and there are a number of people who fail to take a full advantage of this presentation because it goes against what they're used to, what's comfortable for them. So I want you to be aware of that this is a common problem I encounter, and I don't want you to fall into that category. Because let's be honest, the higher ed industry is undergoing significant disruption. The future is not going to be like the past. So for you to succeed in your HR practices, you really need to be on the cutting edge as opposed to on the back edge. So that's where you want to be. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now, the other thing is that there are many people who do agree that these are very valuable, useful strategies, and when they're here in the presentation, but when they get home from the presentation, they don't really take full advantage of these strategies. Have you ever had that happen where you hear a great talk and you don't take full advantage of it when you come back home? Now, yes, it happens, right? So I don't want that to happen to you. So for that to not happen to you, you all have a handout in front of you. So take a look at the handout with the presentation. Now, what I want you to do, we also have a bunch of pens that the corporate sponsors generously provided. I want you to write down that you personally will incorporate these strategies if they resonate with you once you come home to the office. Now, you know that the research shows that if you write something down, you are more likely to make it happen, right? So write it down, make it happen. And that's only if they resonate with you, but do write it down. There's going to be space on the, I think, 3rd or 4th page for you to write things down. All right, great. So I see folks are finishing writing it down. That's great. Now, let's go on to a little bit more of the content of the presentation after we got to the introduction. The first thing I want to say, and that many of you might have thought when I came here and started speaking, not when you saw me, but when I started speaking, is, hey, where's this guy from? You know, right? Where are you from? Obviously, I have an accent. Duh. Where are you from is a question I get asked frequently, including by some people at the conference already. And this is a question that some of you might have asked, folks who have an accent or who don't look like you are mainstream American. You know, some of you, I see some of you nodding your heads who don't look like you're mainstream American. This is a common question. Now, from my accent, some of you might have guessed that, you know, where I'm from. Forget about it, I'm from New York. No, really, my accent is not from New York, but I did live in New York for over a decade when my parents came to the United States when I was 10 from a small country called the Republic of Moldova after the Berlin Wall fell down in 1991. So Berlin Wall fell in 1989, my parents came in 1991. There's Moldova right there. It's well known as one of the least happy places in the world. So I'm really glad that they left. Didn't want to grow up there. And we came, settled in New York City, as I mentioned. Now, we were very poor. We were dirt poor when we settled in. We lived in roach-infested tenement apartments. It was really hard for me to get to school. My parents couldn't afford a bus pass, and the school was about 2 miles away, so I had to walk to the school every day, 2 miles uphill in the snow, both ways. No, really, there were 2 hills. So that was the situation in which I grew up, and I was fortunate that my dad actually found a job in an Italian bakery delivering bread. So at least we always had bread that fell off the back of the truck. And we had to get furniture that was discarded by people. They discarded the furniture for garbage trucks to pick up, so we would go, we'd pick it up, we'd drag it over to our house. And so that was kind of the situation in which we lived. Now, fortunately, when we got to the house, we had some help. You haven't lived until you've seen a couch dragged up the stairs by 300 cockroaches. So it was a tough life for me in that time. But you know what? I chose not to drop my accent. There were many people at that time who came from an Eastern European background, like I did, who chose to drop their accents. And I saw them, and I know why they chose to drop their accents. I talked to them. They weren't proud of their cultural background. They wanted to fit in. They wanted to be part of the mainstream. Now, I was always a bit of a contrarian, and I didn't want to fit in. I guess that made me a good speaker. So I didn't want to fit in, and I also was proud of my cultural heritage. I was proud of my background, even though it was the least happy country in the world, or one of the least happy countries in the world. And so I decided to retain my accent. Now, I later found out that was kind of a dumb decision, to be honest, because of a phenomenon that's known as accent discrimination. Accent discrimination is the false perception of being less trustworthy by people who have a foreign accent. There's only one accent that this doesn't apply to in the United States. Can you guess which one? British, great, yes. We still have that cultural imperialism going. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. So that's the only accent to which it doesn't apply. So that's a phenomenon of accent discrimination, and it's part of a broader category of psychological phenomena which I got to learn about as I went into graduate school and studied the social intelligence, emotional intelligence, decision-making, and there's one really important phenomenon, or 2 related phenomena, called halo and horns effects, which I want to talk about first. So the horns effect and the halo effect. Now, these 2 phenomena have to do with how we perceive other people, how we relate to them. The horns effect has to do with us disliking one characteristic. If we dislike one characteristic of someone, like their accent, if it doesn't fit our predispositions, then we don't like that person as a whole. And if we like one aspect of a person, like the British accent, we like that person as a whole. This psychological phenomenon obviously causes problems for people like me with foreign accents, but it also causes a whole host of other problems like sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, racism, LGBTQ discrimination, and other problems like this. So this is responsible for a lot of what you in HR are trying to fight. And it's also responsible for other kind of unusual phenomena that you wouldn't really think about. Even for people who are trained in addressing these cognitive biases, these biases like you are. Now, I spent about 7 years as a professor at Ohio State, so that's kind of my background. I love to do full-time coaching, consulting, and speaking, but I spent 7 years there as a professor at Ohio State. And as you might know, the big thing at Ohio State is the football. Buckeyes, right? Go Bucks. So that was the big thing. As a professor, I was contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. And some of you who have a big football team or other basketball team or so on might know what I'm talking about. So I was doing a presentation much like this one to the human resources group in Central Ohio, the SHRM group. It's called HRACO. So there was about 100 HR professionals, and it was a presentation on diversity and inclusion at their annual Diversity and Inclusion Conference. And we're talking about Buckeyes and Wolverines. Now, Wolverines is the Michigan football team. Michigan is the big, big rival of the Buckeyes. That's kind of one of the biggest rivalries in football. So not really fans of Michigan there. And I asked them, hey, how many of you, there were about 100 people in the audience, would hire a Michigan fan? Please raise your hand. And how many do you think raise their hands? Come on, somebody loudly. Yes? Who? How many raise their hands? 4 people. Okay, almost right, 3 people. 3 people raised their hands. 3 people would hire Michigan fans. Now, regardless of what you think about Michigan and Ohio State and some of the poor life choices that Michigan fans might have made, yeah, I'm a Buckeye fan. Doesn't make them bad employees. It doesn't mean that they're going to be bad employees. And you know, when I brought that up, the HR people there were really hesitant to agree with me. So that's kind of one of the phenomenon that we don't think about that really impacts us in a really negative way, even people who are trained to do HR expertise, like the people there. And so it's especially dangerous in hiring and promotion, a hail and horns effect. Now, it has a whole range of effects in HR settings in higher education. So for example, I was talking at that back table about training on avoiding sexual harassment and other forms of training. You'll see many of you who are dealing with trying to get faculty into that training find that you have to really drag them, hand and foot. It's really hard to get them into that training. And one of the reasons is that faculty have horns effects around going to the training. Now, they just don't acknowledge that this is a phenomenon that they experience, the halo and horns effect. They think that they're better than that. And so they don't go to these training because they don't think it's necessary, despite a number of stories in the news that you might have seen that show that indeed these trainings are necessary. So that's one type of problem. Now, another type of problem is getting faculty to do diversity and inclusion hiring. I did a number of interviews with folks in this room who told me about how hard it was to get faculty to collaborate with HR on diversity and inclusion hiring. There are so many faculty who just prefer to go and check the box saying, yes, we tried to get a diversified pool of candidates. And I know I see a number of heads nodding, and they didn't really go to HR and try to get them to help out. Now, this is another element of the horns effect and the halo effect. Faculty, it's not like faculty don't want to do diversity and inclusion hiring. What's happening is that they want to retain their independence in hiring, and many feel that going to HR undercuts their independence, regardless of the fact that going to HR would help them do both, retain their independence while also improving diversity and inclusion. Now, there have been a number of success stories. So one of the people in this room, Robin, so if you would stand up, give her a hand, come on, let's help her stand up. She tells me that she was really successful in collaborating with a number of people in HR to get faculty to come to HR and ask for help and get them involved in the process because of a culture that they created in the university of trust and collaboration between HR and faculty. And I strongly encourage you to go to Robin and talk to her about what steps she and others have taken to get that culture going. So that's one thing. Now, another thing that has worked for several people, especially one I want to note, is getting people higher up in the administration getting involved in diversity and inclusion hiring. And Lauren has told me, if so, Lauren, can you stand up, give her a hand, that getting the provost involved in strongly supportive, very actively supporting of diversity and inclusion training has been crucial for diversity and inclusion. So that's kind of another strategy that has worked. So getting higher up administration and getting that culture of trust between HR and faculty. So now I want you to take 30 seconds and think about where horns effects and halo effects might be going on in your campus, in your HR work, and write that down in the handout. So please, take 30 seconds to do so. All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about the broader framework. I started with a specific example of what's going on, some of these problems that are happening. Let's talk about why they happen. What's going on in our brain? What's emotional intelligence? What's social intelligence? Now, you might have heard the term emotional intelligence. It's a pretty frequently used term, famous term. It refers to two things: being aware of your own emotions. So it's one thing, being aware, and then being able to manage your own emotions. So that's emotional intelligence. Now, social intelligence refers to two other things: being aware of other people's emotions, and especially relationships between them, and being able to influence these relationships and these emotions. That's what social intelligence refers to. And that's what we'll focus on in this presentation. So that's social intelligence. And the handout, again, is for you to take notes on these things as you feel willing and able. Let's talk a little bit about our evolutionary heritage and why this presentation goes against gut intuitions, goes against much of the advice you might have received, and talk about the cutting edge of the research on the topic of social intelligence and how we behave as human beings. Specifically, I want to talk about the fight or flight response and tribalism. The fight or flight response is our gut reactions, our intuitions. It's one aspect of what we are about, how we feel comfortable. We are evolved to live in the savanna environment. So that's the environment in which we feel comfortable, the savanna environment. That's where our gut feels comfortable. And so we developed strong fight or flight responses. And that was to escape saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard about this as the saber-toothed tiger response, or the lizard brain. So we deal with any threat in our environment as though it's a saber-toothed tiger, because that is how our ancestors adapted. We are the descendants of those who treated every threat like it was a saber-toothed tiger. The other ones didn't really survive, the saber-toothed tigers. It was better to jump at shadows. It was better to jump at one shadow than to avoid one saber-toothed tiger, than to get eaten by one saber-toothed tiger. So this natural evolutionary consequence. So that's one dynamic that's going on, still very strongly impacting us. The other one is tribalism. We evolved to live in groups, tribes of people who look just like us, behave just like us, who are our family. And that's the second thing that's going on, that's very powerfully driving all of our responses in the modern day: tribalism. So these are two things that our gut feels comfortable with. These are our gut intuitions, these are our reactions. And this is what we have to fight every day, or what you have to fight every day in your HR activities, but I have to fight every day in my consulting, coaching, and speaking, to help people overcome fight or flight responses and tribalism. This is the underpinning of the very surprising and pleasantly surprising behavior, the resistance to change that we talked about. So this is part of basic human nature. What you're doing heroically is fighting human nature. It's very important for you to realize, I'm going to repeat this again, what you're doing is fighting human nature in your HR activities. It's very unnatural for us to work in large higher educational institutions. That's not a natural thing for us to do. It's just not natural. And so doing that will really go against this fight or flight response in many cases, and tribalism in many cases. And so you have to understand and anticipate when the fight or flight response will arise in your faculty and staff, and when the tribalism will arise in your faculty and staff, and address that. So as I mentioned, it was a good fit for the savannah. It was a bad fit for the modern world. You can see it in real life. Here, you had the nice buffet breakfast, right? And in the savannah, it was really important for us to eat as much sugar as possible. Very, very important for us to eat as much sugar as possible. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work very well in the modern environment. Now, I don't know about you. I know I overate some of that French toast. It was delicious. some of you might have overeaten something else, right? It's very easy to do so. Why is that? Well, because our gut reaction pulls us to eat all the sugar. So that's how we survived. And that's a problem, obviously. So it's a problem for our physical health. It's a problem for healthy organizational culture. And so that's the broader framework that I want you to be thinking about. That really goes against much of the advice you might have received, you might hear in the future to go with your gut. So let's talk a little bit about how our mind works, what's going on. We have, so forget about the old IDS, subconscious, superconscious, the Freudian stuff. That's been long superseded. There are approximately two, roughly speaking, thinking systems. The autopilot system, which is our gut response, mainly with the fight or flight and the tribalism. It's very subconscious, fast, automatic, habitual, super quick. It reacts in milliseconds. It's great in many ways. It takes us out of the way of a moving car. You don't want to be thinking for a long time before you do that. That's a good way for us to react. And assesses threats in many cases. It's good for physical threats. It's not good for abstract thinking, for complex thinking, for institutional thinking. For that, there's the intentional system. There's the logical, rational, conscious, slow, effortful system. When you're trying to resist that second piece of chocolate cake or cookie or toast, French toast, that's what you're using. And you could see the effort, the willpower you're putting in to resist taking that. So that's what you see in real life. And the same effort you're putting in to resist the tribalism, to resist the fight or flight response. And so are all the other staff, and so are the faculty. To behave in a civilized manner in a higher ed institution or other complex modern organization. Now there are over 100 specific problematic modes of thinking, like the halo and horns effect that we found. They're called cognitive biases. So you might have heard of them. These are dangerous judgment errors, specific types of frequent mistakes we make as human beings just because we're biased, unfortunately, in these ways. And it's nothing to be ashamed about, the tribalism and the halo and horns effect. It's highly problematic when it's brought up as something to be blameworthy or shamed about, because it's a part of a natural human reaction. It really won't help in the long term to use blame or shame to address these problems. When you talk about them as part of what it means to be a human being, and at the same time, to live in a civilization means overcoming these issues. We can still have these feelings. The question is, how do we respond to them? And that's the halo and horns effect as an obvious example of tribalism. We'll talk about some others. First, I want to talk about losing. Now, none of you wants to lose, I presume. It's a bad thing. We generally don't like to lose. So I'm going to ask you a question. You have a kind stranger who walks up to you and says, hey, I'm going to give you two things. You can have $45 in cash right now, or I'm going to flip a coin, and if you win the coin flip, if you get heads, I'm going to give you $100. If you get tails, I'm going to give you nothing. So that's your choice. Now, who of you would prefer the $45 in cash? Please raise your hands. Cool, awesome. Who would prefer the coin flip? Oh, I love this. This is perfect. This actually aligns perfectly well. I like this straw poll. I talk to HR audiences often. And what I do is I get 80 to 85% of HR audiences prefer the $45 in cash. Now, so this is just something that I've seen. So you're right on with the other HR audiences, like around the country. And I haven't done this around the world as much, so I don't have as much of a baseline. So you have, when I was first presented with this problem in graduate school by my mentor, I also chose the $45 in cash. It's like, okay, solid amount of money, right there, good stuff, right? And he told me that, well, most people in studies, not simply HR professionals, most people in studies also prefer $45 in cash. So that's their preference when they're asked what they choose. But what I didn't realize and what they don't realize is that in the long term, this choice causes them to lose. It's caused them to be a loser. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, the $45 in cash, that's $45. the 50% chance, the coin flip of winning $100 is the equivalent to $50. So over the long term, you have 45, 45, 45, 45, guaranteed 45, that's going to give you 270. If you have, that's going to give you 45, 45, what is 90? 180. Now, if you have the coin flip, over time, you'll get the $200. So once you lose, once you win, once you lose, once you win, 50% chance, right? And I told him, hey, you presented this as a one-off. If you presented this as a repeating scenario, I might have thought about this differently. So what gives? And what he told me was that we tend to perceive everything as a one-off. Our gut reaction tends to perceive all life choices as a one-off situation. As a result of perceiving each situation as a one-off, we make choices to avoid losses. We don't want to lose the $45 in cash, and so the 50% chance, it's kind of like, well, I don't know if I'll win or not, who knows, right? And so we tend to prefer things that cause us to avoid losses. It's a very natural evolutionary dynamic. In the evolutionary environment, we couldn't save resources. No matter how big of a bison you killed, you can't carry all that meat before droughts, right? You can't put it in your bank account. You didn't have a fridge. So you had no way of preserving these resources. So that's one dynamic that's going on. And so if you gave up resources, you were much more likely to die if you took a risk. Whereas obviously in the current environment, you're not going to die if you make this choice. But it feels like it. That's the fight or flight response. That's one dynamic. The other one is long-term stability. So the second one. In the ancestral environment, we didn't have long-term stability. It was better to preserve short-term resources. We can't bank on the long term. Whereas here, you put your money in the bank, it's insured up to whatever it is, $1 million, I think. So by the federal government, you can bank on the long term. So these two dynamics cause us to make really bad choices in trying to avert losses. And you could see it intuitively on your bank account. Now, let's say you have a salary of $50,000. Let's just go with that. And 45 versus 50 is a difference of 10%. Now, if the difference of 10%, if you fall into loss aversion in your salary, means that you'll make $5,000 less a year. And that's a big hit to your bank account if you think about it from the long term. And that's the kind of choices we tend to make as human beings. And that's one of the big reasons why people resist change. They focus on the short term. They don't think about the long-term impact of change, and they're very uncomfortable with the short-term effects of going through the change. So this is a big problem that all of you are facing. Now, one of the conversations I had here, well, let me give actually an example from Ohio State. So when I was at Ohio State in 2012, there was a major retirement plan change. And it was pretty major, pretty huge. I got there in 2011, so it was a year after I got there, so I spent some time there. And it was announced somewhat suddenly, without much communication about it. And the faculty and staff were kind of in an uproar. You had a number of prominent faculty leaving the institution, which was definitely not the intention. So Ohio State kind of got a black eye. There was really a problem for staff morale. And because the faculty and the staff didn't want to lose. They had their previous plan, and they were really afraid of what this would mean to them. And they didn't really have good communication to them about the situation. I was in the situation of one of the professors who was getting the communication. Let me tell you, it was not good. It was very complex, language, technical language that I couldn't really get through. I mean, I'm in the social sciences, I'm not in accounting. So that's my background. So that was a problem, and that was a problem that happened at Ohio State when I was a faculty member. Now, I was talking to another person here who described what happened in her institution in 2010. There was a major, again, change to the retirement plan, 403B retirement plan, when the plans went from 300 options that faculty could choose to only 20 options. And a number of other big changes. I'm not going to go in depth into it. But it was basically pretty scary. It was pretty problematic. It was harrowing for faculty to face that. They were scared. But the communication there was much, much, much better. Both the volume and the frequency of communication was much more thorough. So that was something that got faculty on board with the change. Faculty were much more welcoming of that. And for a number of people who told me about experiences of change in their institution, they highlighted the importance of frequency and volume of communication as being pretty key to getting faculty and staff to accept short-term losses for the long-term gain of themselves and their institution. So that's really important, and it's something that's really rarely realized as a strategy to address change in institutions. There was an article in September 30th, 2014 on the main CUPA HR blog called "That Change Doesn't Have to Be So Scary," that talked about, hey, how about getting faculty involved in the change process and getting them part of the process. Now, that's a good strategy in its own way. However, it really, I have to tell you that the article was a bit misleading when it said change doesn't have to be scary. It will always be scary. So let me be very clear and specific. It will always be scary. What your goal is, your goal as HR professionals is to make faculty and staff more scared of not changing. So that is your goal. Get loss aversion working for you. Think about how can you frame the issue in such a way that the faculty and staff will lose more by not collaborating with a change, by not participating in the change in the long term. How will they lose more in the long term? So that's what you have to do. That's what you have to do. You have to get them on the coin flip side, not on the $45 cash side. Long-term repeating scenarios. So think about that aspect of things, and I want you to write that down. How might loss aversion be playing a role in your university, and how might you address it? So again, 30 seconds. All right, let's go on to one more of these called the empathy gap. Now, this is a really interesting one. We tend to think, and this is an easy thing to think about, that when somebody is working for an institution, we pay them, they work, that's all. That's kind of the relationship. And unfortunately, it's often too easy to underestimate the importance of emotions in people's motivations, whereas the research shows that our actions and our thoughts are motivated by emotions. About 80 to 90% of our actions and thoughts are motivated by our emotions. They are driven by our emotions. I was working with, so this was not a high, I was working with a client called the Edison Welding Institute. I wouldn't name a client unless they permitted me. So this is a client that permitted me to name the situation, describe it, give me a testimonial. The Edison Welding Institute in Columbus, Ohio. And I was working with the HR director there, Mark Madsen. And what they wanted to do, what the HR director wanted to do, was to convince the engineers who were part of this engineering consulting company, there are about 200-ish engineers, to do selling, to do effective selling. Going and doing presentations, conference papers. Engineers weren't really interested in selling, kind of like your faculty. Not really interested in doing fundraising. Not really interested in doing marketing. That's not their expertise. They want to solve the complex academic research problems. The engineers wanted to solve the complex technical problems. And so they brought me in to try to get the engineers to do selling. What I found was that when the company was trying to convince engineers to do selling, what they were doing was using terms like being a brand, so improving the organization and so on, terms that really weren't resonating emotionally with the engineers. And so I came to Mark and I told Mark, hey, Mark, your terms really, the way you're speaking to your engineers, they're not really resonating with the engineers. They're not really resonating with the emotions of the engineers' emotions. And Mark asked me, engineers have emotions? Now, you might sometimes think that about your faculty, don't you? That they don't really present as having emotions, neither do engineers, but they're driven at the core by emotions, by various desires, fear, anxieties, pleasure, other things, which we can talk about in more depth. So I talked to the engineers, did a 360, did some focus groups, found out that what really motivated them was social status among peers. That was really important for them, and that's of course going to be very important among your faculty too. And what we did was we changed the reward structure in terms of terminology, how you spoke to the engineers, to praise the engineers who did do marketing, who did do conference presentations, who did become thought leaders, wrote blogs, and so on. And the engineers after that were much more motivated to do selling. So it's a matter of finding their emotional resonance points and engaging with them. When was the last time you spoke to faculty about what was keeping them up at night? What are their fears? What are their concerns? I talked to a number of faculty members in preparation for this talk. The number one concern I heard among faculty members was technological disruption. That was the number one concern. A number of faculty are afraid that they will be replaced by distance learning. There are many faculty who are afraid of this. Kind of especially the younger faculty, that's kind of their number one fear that I heard. Something that somebody who is in this room told me about that I didn't really think about. Some of the faculty mentioned this. So this was kind of like a number two fear, is changing students, changing student body. Students are, according to the faculty, not making a factual statement, increasingly disrespectful, playing with their phones instead of engaging with faculty, not really resonating with what the faculty are saying, talking back to the faculty, demanding safe spaces, not judging safe spaces, underreporting what the faculty are saying. So this is this number two fear of faculty members. And do you know what your faculty are afraid of? Maybe some of these things, maybe some other things. It's really hard to do so when there are no effective open lines of communication between HR and faculty. There were a number of people here in this room who told me that because of budget cuts, previous things that created lines of communication were cut. Things like community events, things like award dinners, those sorts of things. Now, there are a number of HR people here who told me that this was one of the things that they really protected, to ensure that there was a culture of open communication between the faculty and the HR. They protected these award dinners, community events, these sorts of things. Soft things, we call them, community building things, which in the end prove incredibly important for trust between HR and faculty members. So I want you to think about where the empathy gap might be playing a role in your organization, in your higher ed institution, and what you can do to address it. So again, take 30 seconds, please. Fortunately, there are effective ways of addressing the empathy gap, which I'll send you this PowerPoint by email. There will be an opportunity for you to share your email. I'll send the PowerPoint so you don't have to write this all down. But this is an empathy building exercise. We're not going to go through it here, but this is something that you can do with faculty members, with staff, to address the situation. So what you do is, it's a pretty simple exercise. It's research-driven. It works. You share with the person something you're worried about in your job right now, and you listen to the person without interrupting, just listening, then paraphrase, echo what they're saying. And that way you get to learn what's going on. And then you share what's going on with you and what's worrying you in your job right now. And then you switch roles, and then you discuss your experience of this exercise with each other. It's a really easy exercise to do. It doesn't take too much time, and it's very effective at addressing the empathy gap. So again, I'll send you the PowerPoint. I don't need to copy it down right now. Now let's talk a little bit about dealing with these dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases. How can we deal with them? What are the keys to addressing these? There are 3 keys: learning about them and watching out for them for yourself. It's kind of an obvious one. Talked about the hail and horns effect and the Buckeyes. Even HR professionals who are highly trained are susceptible when they're not specifically looking for the hail and horns effect and other problems that might be influencing them. Integrate this knowledge into your team and your organization, and implement research-based approaches to address these problems. These are the 3 things you can be doing. So let's talk a little bit about what you specifically can be doing. So take a look at this handout on your table. Now this is a very handy tool which you just fold over with the inside information, my business card inside, and the other questions on the outside. And you use this as a guide for yourself You can give it out to others. We have much more on the table outside in the exhibit hall by the registration to help people address these judgment errors. Now, the first one is, what important information did I not yet fully consider? So that's a really important one. You want to not be stuck in analysis paralysis, but so we're focusing on important information. You know, what information about this person who is a Michigan fan did I not yet fully consider? What information about this proposal to make significant changes that are not yet fully considered? One person who I talked to here told me that if they know they're going to start strategic planning at the university, they don't start announcing the strategic planning of 2 weeks in advance of when the strategic planning occurs. They start communicating about it 18 months before it occurs. Get people prepared in the long term. The same thing with the retirement plan that I mentioned. Long-term communication about the issue. You want to make sure to generate sufficient options. One of the big problems that we find in the research on cognitive biases in decision making is that people don't generate sufficient options before they make decisions. So one of the people here that I talked to spoke about how there was a challenge in terms of healthcare plan options that the university generated, where faculty were not convinced that these were the best options available for them when they were trying to make changes. And that's kind of one of the things that you want to be thinking about. Did you consider all the options? That's the first one. What information did I not fully consider? What relevant dangerous judgment errors did I not yet address now? I think I mentioned this, but I wrote a book about this, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. So this is a book that's in the exhibit hall, and you can get a copy of this book. It talks about a lot of these dangerous judgment errors that you can address effectively, strategically, through doing what you want to be doing. So that's kind of another one, and that I strongly recommend. There are other tools, obviously, that you can use to learn about the dangerous judgment errors and how you can address them. What would a trusted and objective advisor suggest you do? This is a great tool. You have so many people around your tables right now who can serve as a fellow peer mentor, colleague, who you can use as an advisor. They don't work at your institution. You can air your dirty laundry to them, make the promise of confidence. So talk to each other, make these connections. Get yourself a coach, get yourself a consultant, get yourself a colleague within the institution. So get somebody. And if you don't have somebody, try to step outside of yourself. Think about what would somebody who is not a Buckeye fan say about this Michigan potential employee. So that's another strategy. Then, this is a really important one, perhaps the most important one for implementation, once you already made a decision. How have I addressed all the ways that this can fail? There are so many ways to address potential problems in advance if you think about it thoroughly, if you generate all these options. So for example, there is one of the people here told me about how they're implementing a new applicant tracking system and how faculty are really resistant to using this applicant tracking system because it's technological, they're confused about a number of things, it's part of the disruption. This could have been pre-planned, and this could have been addressed a little bit more in advance if they anticipated this problem. And so can a lot of the changes that you are implementing. And finally, what new information will cause me to revisit this decision? This is something that causes a lot of stress to people after they make this decision. If they are not sure whether the decision should be revisited or not, do you want to rethink it or not? It's much more effective if you decide in advance. This information will cause me to revisit it. This information won't, rather than making the decision to revisit it in the heat of the moment. So these are the 5 questions. Very good tips to remember, and you can keep this on your desk, hand it out to others, have it in yourself, little tent card to remind yourself of this. Now, if you look at your handout, go a few pages into it. I think it's going to be something like page 10? 9, thank you. So there's an assessment on dangerous judgment errors that you can have yourself take, and you can have everyone take. I'll send you an email copy, so don't worry about how you'll receive it. So what you can do is get everyone on your team and yourself to take this assessment. So if you flip to the first page of the assessment itself, you'll see the kind of questions it asks. So one is, how often do projects run over time and over budget? And all of these sorts of questions, all of these behaviors identify one of the 30 biggest cognitive biases that cause big problems in higher ed institutions and other complex organizations. So what you want to do is take this assessment, have your employees take this assessment. This is a great tool for you to, one, learn about what's going on, second, teach others about what's going on. Very effective tool. This assessment is an evaluation and education tool at once. And it's great because it uses terminology that doesn't cause people to self-reveal. It doesn't say, you know, I do this. It says someone in your organization does this X% of the time. So again, it gets you to, people can reveal what's going on without putting themselves on the spot. And you'll receive this by email. The final technique is failure proofing. This has to do with the fourth question: how do you prevent problems in advance? Now, you might have heard about this post-mortem. The Army does this after every tactical operation. What did we do? What went wrong? How can we fix it in advance? There's another strategy that decision science strategists have discovered called prospective hindsight. Basically, you look in advance at what's going on and you try to address it in advance. Used by some of the largest companies that I named earlier with which I consulted. They use this specifically for major projects and processes to see what can go wrong with this project and how can we address these problems in advance. There's a manual to it which you'll receive as well. Now, I want you to remember 3 key takeaways. We're coming to the last portion of the presentation. There are 3 key takeaways from this presentation, the things I started with. Don't just go with your gut. It's very tempting. It's very intuitive. It's what a lot of gurus will give you advice to do, go with your gut. That's why they're highly paid. They give you advice that you're comfortable with. They don't give you advice that's actually necessarily true. They give you the advice that's comfortable. That's why they get paid. Watch out for dangerous judgment errors. We have over 100 of these dangerous judgment errors. The assessment goes into the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in our institutions. There are many others that affect our everyday life, financial decision making, and so on. Integrate strategies to address dangerous judgment errors into your decision making, into your team and your organization. We talked about 3 strategies. Very easy 5 questions. 5 questions, super easy. Any of your employees can do this. Give this out to your employees, any of them can do it. Then the assessment. That's something for you on an institutional basis to have your employees take as an educational and assessment tool. And finally, the pre-mortem strategy. That's more of a strategic tool for you to do with your leadership on a leadership level. I want you to invest in social intelligence for the sake of your HR success in higher educational settings. In the next 12 months, invest 25% of resources devoted to professional development and process improvement to protecting yourself from these dangerous judgment errors. Something you learned about right now, it's something that's really helpful for you to protect yourself in the future. Now, you should be spending about 10% or so of your resources on professional development and process improvement. In time, you know, with 2 weeks of, let's say you work 35 hours a week, 2 weeks of holidays a year, or of vacation a year, and all the holidays, that's about 1,700 hours a year. Then 170 hours per year should be devoted to professional development and process improvement, and 41 of those should be devoted to protecting yourself from dangerous judgment errors. And the same thing with your money. So I know most higher ed institutions on average spend maybe about $2,000 on professional development per employee, so $500 of those should be spent on protecting themselves from dangerous judgment errors in the next 12 months. Now, this was on the cutting edge, so this is something that pioneering, forward-looking HR professionals will benefit greatly from, and you are the ones whose initiatives will flourish. You'll have a lot of benefits for yourself if you do so, as well as for your team. You can focus on doing things that are going to cause you much less stress and anxiety. Now think about all the halo and horns effects, the empathy gap, the loss aversion, how much stress and anxiety those are causing you and people around you. And that's just 4 of all the major judgment errors that we as human beings tend to make because of our fight and flight response, because of our gut reactions. You can focus on the core of your HR activities. You have a ton of stuff to do. You don't need to spend your time firefighting, solving problems in the moment. Addressing these dangerous judgment errors in advance will really help you focus on the future, focus on the core of your activities rather than firefighting. And it will help you exceed expectations for the administration, for the staff and the faculty, for the students, for the parents, and for the community around you, because you will address problems in advance. And that's super important for your success. And I want you to be thinking about what's your story as you walk out of here. Do you want to think of yourself as the people who, I heard a paradigm shifting presentation, really went against a lot of advice, very strong stuff, going against gut reactions, going against intuitions, and I let it slip through the cracks despite what I wrote about in the beginning of the presentation. That's one story. You can be that type of person. Or do you want to be a different type of person? Do you want to be the type of person who said, hey, I heard a paradigm shifting presentation, was on the cutting edge of research, person spoke to a number of our HR professionals, adapted to the content of what we specifically need in our HR practice, and I integrated this stuff. I took these strategies, I brought them home to my institution, and now we're starting to really take it to the next level, do much more with less, as all of you have to do, unfortunately, but truly. So I want you to think about what kind of HR leader you're going to be as you walk out of this room. I believe that you're going to be the HR leader, the second HR leader who steps up and takes their institution to the next level. Thank you very much.